Hello there. Today we're going to be talking about euthanasia. Not youth in Asia, but euthanasia. So let's start by imagining a female friend is suffering from a chronic disease where she will probably die in about a year's time. Although she will die, the pain she's suffering is physically unbearable, and she asks the doctor to give her a pill that's going to relieve this pain, aka dying. Now, do you think this is acceptable? Daniel Callahan wrote a piece called The Case Against Euthanasia in a philosophy book called Disputing Moral Issues. He argues that euthanasia is morally wrong. He also believes that enforcing such a law would be extremely difficult. First, we're going to explore the ethical reasons why he thinks euthanasia is wrong, and then we're going to look at how it's hard to implement such a law. Callahan explains his first ethical point by drawing parallels between suicide and euthanasia, because technically both acts are voluntarily and in response to unbearable pain. He notes that suicide is the worst way to deal with pain and generally incites a negative emotion in people, even if they understand the motive behind this act. For example, people who go to funerals of suicide victims rarely feel relieved that this life of misery is at ease. So he asks, or he questions, that if suicide is shunned upon, why should euthanasia be encouraged? Another ethical reason against euthanasia is the notion of private killing. He argues that if legal, euthanasia is no longer a social issue, rather it becomes an individual one since a physician is now involved. This doctor-patient relationship gives the doctor an enormous power over the patient, which can lead to actual killings rather than patient-requested suicide. He gives an example in the Dutch experience. In the Netherlands, when euthanasia was first legal, the government established a commission of euthanasia in 1990s where they took anonymous surveys of doctors to ask about euthanasia. They found that about 1,000 cases was intentional termination of life without explicit request, and about 10% of these cases was actually done with competent patients who were not asked for their consent. Callahan fears that if this law should be enforced, this abuse could go on in the USA. Another popular argument for euthanasia, used by Callahan's opposition, James Rachels, states that there is no inherent moral difference between killing a patient by euthanasia and letting a patient die by terminating the patient's life support. For example, turning off the patient's ventilator. He also states, by terminating the patient's life support, the doctor prolongs suffering. Therefore, active euthanasia is morally permissible than passive euthanasia. And take example, this is a patient. I could either kill the patient with lethal injection or take the patient's life support and allow the patient to die. Callahan finds holes in his argument, and we're going to talk about this later. Callahan finds holes in James Rachel's argument. He rebuts his statement by saying that patients with truly fatal diseases are going to die in the long run. At some point, the physician will have to take the patient off treatment when it's obvious that it's ineffective. However, he asks, how can it be said that a physician quickens a patient's death by taking the patient off life-saving treatment? A patient is supposed to die much earlier because the treatment is supposed to prolong life rather than shorten it. Furthermore, to think that killing a patient and letting the patient die is the same is equal to saying a doctor has enormous power to abolish lethal diseases and saying that the patient's death is solely the doctor's fault. He concludes by saying that the killing of a patient is not the same as letting die. Therefore, it's not the physician's fault if a patient dies by taking the patient off treatment. So now I have provided reasons why Callahan is ethically against euthanasia. So now let's look at why it's really hard for the law to enforce euthanasia. So some people might ask, hey, if it's a free country, why shouldn't I be able to know how to end my life? Well, Callahan has a few reasons for this, and let's look at it. Callahan argues that a law permitting euthanasia would have social implications far beyond just allowing patients to decide to kill themselves. It would send ripples through society in general and medicine in particular. The law, he claims, is a teacher providing ways for which we should live our lives, and legalizing euthanasia would only promote the wrong kind of message. Moreover, he claims that an actual enforcement of the law would be extremely difficult. The privacy of the doctor-patient relationship would mean that there's a place where the law cannot enter. Therefore, there will be no way of actually knowing if the law is being obeyed. All laws are subject to be abused, especially if it's a controversial one in the first place. Another reason brought up in favor of euthanasia is the notion of self-determination. If euthanasia becomes a law, people might start to ask, why should the right of self-determination only be limited to people who are terminally ill? He claims that impending death is not the only horrible thing to happen in life, and that people with mental depression or other mental problems can claim unbearable suffering. Therefore, as we can see, self-determination cannot be controlled by the law, and because of this, euthanasia should not be a law. Now let's review why Callahan is against euthanasia. First of all, he thinks that it gives doctors enormous power, which could lead to the notion of private killing. Second of all, he believes that passive euthanasia is not the same as active euthanasia. Third of all, with the law, he thinks that the law provides people a way to live their lives. Therefore, legalizing euthanasia will send the wrong kind of message. And lastly, the actual enforcement of the law would be really hard to implement since there are way too many loopholes. In conclusion, Callahan states that we shouldn't ask for euthanasia all in the name of dying with dignity. Death is a fundamental fact of human biology. Therefore, dignity cannot be lost. People who died in concentration camps and Holocaust die with as much dignity as people who die gracefully in their sleep. Individuals should learn to rise up to adversity. And finally, physicians' jobs are already tough enough. Therefore, the law shouldn't put them in a position where they have to choose between their moral compass and obeying the law. Thank you.